All right, welcome back. We have some time now to look at multiple choice. I need to remind you that tomorrow we have our A1, and Wednesday we have our A2, which is the essay, and then Thursday you have multiple choice, and then Friday I come to work and you don't. So it really is midterm. It is the halfway point of the quarter, and we have exams this week. Our first set of exams. We don't have a lot of exams. This morning we talked about A1 and A2. Now we're going to talk about multiple choice. I'd like to answer your questions, and then when we get to a point where there's no questions, I will go over a few things that I think you should ask questions about. And then when we hit a wall and nothing else is happening in here, then I will stop recording and just give you some time to do some further studying. Okay, let's begin with questions. You should have questions, and you also should have your notebook out. Please keep in mind multiple choice is worth 1/2 of your mark this year. The other half is basically the A1 and A2s. So we've done a lot of work to get the A1 process down. And we've done a lot of work to get the A2 process down. And in terms of multiple choice, I would suggest to you that the work that you need to do is to make sure you understand the terminology in the case studies. All of the online lessons are in our digital textbook, but maybe you have some questions. So let's begin there. What kind of questions do you guys have? Yes, sir.
Are there going to be non-source questions?
There's a few. So of the 58 questions, there might be somewhere between 2 to 4 that are independent of sources. So sometimes that's cause for celebration, because if it's a source-based question, then the answer's on the page. There's some kind of work that you can do to find the answer. If it's a discrete question, which is the term used to describe a non-source based question, then it's more recall based. So there's 2 to 4 non-source questions. And the other questions about either the test or content related questions. Maybe there's a term you want me to revisit. Remember, this was your homework for the weekend. You're meant to go over your notes and come up with some questions. And here we are, in silence. Yes?
Can you redefine the hallmark for me, please? That was
Redefine
hallmark?
hallmark?
Yeah. Or something like that.
Hegemony?
I think, yeah.
Is it hegemony?
It says hallmark on my paper.
Can I see it on your paper? Because when you say hallmark, I'm thinking like the store that used to sell cards.
It's like hallmark.
I do not know. Sorry. It looks like Walmart, but with a hall. Maybe I was saying Walmart, and
I came up with one of our videos, and it had like a different definition from not Walmart.
not Walmart. So if something has like a key characteristic, it might be hallmark of something, like a defining characteristic. That might be the way that the term was used, but it's not 2 words, it's 1, and it's probably being pronounced differently, but it's basically a defining characteristic. Yes?
In the intro of the essay, what was supposed to break down the source?
Absolutely. Yeah. The intro to the essay is where you break down the language of the source. Absolutely. Yes?
What is hegemony?
Hegemony is the domination by, so we may talk about American hegemony or British hegemony or Roman hegemony. And these are times in history where either the Americans, the British, or Romans were able to dominate their sphere of influence, their part of the world. Yes, sir?
Is there going to be just 4 choices in each question?
No, the questions are going to be from grade 10, 11, and 12 now, and on the diploma, A, B, C, and D. No E's, and yeah, it's not going to be just 2, it's going to be 4. Yes?
I'm assuming it will be Scantron.
Yes, because it'll take me, I don't know if it'll take me 100 hours to mark your A1s and A2s, so I need a machine to mark your multiple choice for me. Yes, sir?
What is the opposite of globalization?
So isolation. So the opposite of globalization might be when we look at North Korea and they try to practice isolationism, where they try to close their borders and rather than connecting with others, try to stay disconnected. Even North Korea is connected with others today. They rely on China heavily for resources and for aid. But isolationism would be the opposite. Next year in grade 12 or grade 11, when you study nationalism, there's some nationalists might argue that rather than being globalist, rather than thinking of Canada as a part of a community of nations, we need to just think of ourselves as an independent entity. So there's an element of nationalism within isolationism. And there would be a need for self-sufficiency, which is autarky. Autarky is an economic system where you don't need trade from others, but isolationism would be the opposite of globalism. Any other questions? So based upon the lack of questions, I'm guessing that we're going to do really well on this test. Because it was just so clear the first time, right? Just like, you know what, Mr. McBride, the lessons have been so clear, we don't have questions. So, some things that you could ask questions about. So starting with the beginning of the year related to issue 1, we study globalization, and it means the interconnectedness of mankind. But there are dimensions of it. There's economic dimensions of it. How do we connect with others economically, as consumers, as producers? How do we connect with others politically and socially? So there will be a question early on, number 1. It's going to look at globalization and the dimensions of globalization. It's going to already tell you about economic and political dimensions, and then it wants you to tell me about what would social dimensions look like. What's an example of a social dimension of your life? So there'll be 4 examples, and then you'll have to look at them and distinguish which one is talking about social values as opposed to economics or politics. Second question of the exam is going to focus on corporations and media. And we had a mini lesson on the media. And in your notes on the media, you should have phrases like, yeah, you need to go. Yeah, you bet. In that mini lesson on media, there should be phrases like watchdog of democracy, pillar of accountability, and we want you to be able to connect those concepts with the role that the media is meant to play. So there'll be a cartoon that is looking at the role of a media that is unable to fulfill its function in a free and democratic society. And we want you to be able to think critically as to what service to the people it's not doing. Questions 3 and 4 will have 4 speakers that you've never seen before. So it's not about them, but it's more of a reading comprehension where we ask you to read through them and find out, which of the 4 speakers is saying globalization has been a positive force in cultural exchange. So my suggestion for you on this multiple choice would be to read the question before you read the sources. The 4 sources, there's a lot of the page covered there. So before you read them and then read the question, then now I got to reread them. because I didn't know why I was reading them. Read the question first, and then now you have a reason to read them. And the question says, which ones say that globalization had a positive force on cultural exchange? Then you can go back over the 4 and just see which one's saying it's positive. Which 2 are saying it's positive, and then there's the answer. And then if there's ever a question that tries to compare the 2. So question number 4 says, the major similarity in opinion expressed by speakers 2 and 4. So now I might have to go back and just relook at 2 and 4 and say, what do they have in common? What do they have in common? That relationship is a skill we've been developing with A1. So some of the same skills that we've been doing with A1, we see applied here on the multiple choice. Like, how do these 2 sources, in this case, 2 quotes by 2 speakers, what do they have in common? What's their similarity? Some questions on the test may be too easy. So there's going to be some really hard ones and some really easy ones. And that's by design. It's meant to help us discriminate in terms of trying to figure out, where your mark is at. So some of them will be based upon some concepts that are fairly straightforward. There will be, for questions 5 and 6, there'll be a map of the world. And, the map is labeled by continent. So there's not really a lot that you need to know going in, except that I would suggest to you, review the concept of digital divide in related issue 1. So go back and look at what that term means, the digital divide. And what the term means is that there's places in the world with less access to technology, including the internet, than other places, because they are living in less developed, more impoverished areas. And that's an easy concept to show on a map. Continuing on with related issue 1 and the role of the media, there's a quote in the textbook by Marshall McLuhan from the University of Toronto about the global village and how it's technology that has enabled us to be so connected in this global village. So some of the multiple choice on the test, it's similar to an A1 in the sense that you've studied, you have the background knowledge of the terms, but now there's an application of your knowledge. Meaning that you can't really memorize anything to get ready, but you have to, on the day of the test, actually apply it. It's going to be a cartoon where we want you to know the difference between marginalization, homogenization, acculturation, and those terms. So definitely go back and review those terms. So it won't be enough just to memorize the definitions. It's not a fill-in-the-blank test. You have to be able to look at a cartoon and say, which concept's being portrayed here? Are they showing us assimilation? Are they showing us acculturation? Are they showing us homogenization? So by knowing the definitions, now you know what to look for, but then you have to apply it to the cartoon. And when there's a cartoon, look for any of the wording, look for the characters and what they're saying to each other, and I think the answer is going to be quite obvious. It's going to be multiple cartoons on the test. So another skill that we could ask you to do with the test would be to give you a cartoon and then say, which of these following statements would be supported by information within the cartoon. Similar skill that we want for A1. So we're going to give you a cartoon, and again, you got to look for the details within the cartoon. So within the cartoon, there's an individual making a statement about globalization being bad. But then the cartoonist is making a statement about the individual. So now you got to look at the perspective of the cartoonist and say, okay, which statement here is being supported by the cartoonist? So there's some work to do with cartoons for sure. Sometimes it might be the shorter quotes that are more challenging. So there's a quote that says, the history of globalization is the story of a series of planetary contractions. That's it. That's the quote. So not a lot to play with there. And then a question could be, with regards to these planetary contractions, what's an example that applies to the Columbian Exchange? Or what's an example that applies to the age of exploration? We studied the Industrial Revolution. And when we studied it, we applied it to the zero-sum theory, competition among global rivals like England and France. We want you to know, what were they competing for? During the Industrial Revolution, it initiated a competition between Britain and France globally for what? And they were competing for, as we see in India, impressive by the way, your tongue is quite green, resources and markets. Resources and markets. So why did Britain go to India? Because they needed indigo, but they also needed to sell their textiles. Questions 12 and 13. We'll have 4 further speakers, this time quite short. Again, it's not about the speakers, it's about what they're saying. We want you to be able to read them and to contrast them and say, okay, among these 4 speakers, which one is most critical of globalization? So now, you just have to read through them and compare them and say, okay, 1 and 2. Okay, between these 2, 2 is more critical. 2 and 3, okay, now it's 3 that's most critical. 3 and 4, and then go back and check. And I came up with those numbers like randomly. I'm not trying to give you the answer. But you'll have to be able to read and comprehend. Read and synthesize information. And really in this case, contrast, right? Contrast their opinions. Then number 13, same set of questions, or same set of sources. It says, which speaker refers to the benefits from globalization for consumers? It's a matching game. So you got to go back and say, which one's talking about consumption, consumers, and saying it's a good thing. So those are the types of questions that the answers on the page. For number 13, if you work hard enough, long enough, you'll find the answer. So on Thursday, there's 58 questions. You almost have 4 hours to do them. That's an incredible amount of time. You shouldn't be in a rush to get done. Number 14, there's going to be a little bit longer of a quote, and it's a description of either capitalism, mercantilism, the triangle trade, or the plantation system. So we want you to be able to look back and say, okay, we've learned some economic systems like capitalism and mercantilism. Do I know the difference? Would I be able to read a description and say, oh man, that's capitalism, or that's clearly mercantilism? So what's the difference? There's going to be quotes. Again, a lot of quotes about globalization, right? Because that's this course. So we have a quote from Linda Bull, the Cree from Goldfish Lake. When she talks about globalization, she has 3 sentences. And then my question for you is, Linda Bull sees globalization as what? Is it a threat? Is it an opportunity? Is it complex, or is it multidimensional? So you got to go back and you have to apply these 4 synthetic conclusions about what she said. Is she saying it's a threat? So you read through it again and say, is there anything here that shows me evidence she thinks globalization's a threat, that it hurts someone or it's a danger to someone? Is it an opportunity? What are some words that mean opportunity? Do I see words like that in here? Is she talking about it being complex or multidimensional? And then we want you to be able to contrast her opinion and say, of these 4 people, who may logically oppose her? Another skill we've been doing with A1 is the division of society. So who would align themselves ideologically opposed to Linda Bull? And we'll give you 4 descriptions of people. Moving on to 17 and 18, we have 4 perspectives again, all on globalization. And we want you to talk about, which one is most likely from an indigenous perspective. Which one seems to be describing their experiences with globalization. And then which one's from a Eurocentric perspective. Which one is disproving of Columbus. Which one sees globalization as a force. So, There's actually 5 questions here, 17 to 21, all about these 4 speakers, these 4 perspectives. Same skill with A1 that we've been doing every day. Breaking down language and finding ideological perspectives. So now we're breaking down the language and we're saying, who's most Eurocentric? Who's most likely indigenous? Who's most disapproving of Columbus? Who sees globalization as a force? And what does this guy think? That it's inevitable or beneficial or detrimental? So multiple choice in social studies, by the time you get to high school, becomes quite skill orientated. It's a test of skill. So number 22, we're going to be describing, again, much like we did with capitalism and mercantilism in a previous question, we're going to be describing something, and we want you to be able to say, okay, what's the difference between the Industrial Revolution and the Columbian Exchange? If somebody gives me 4 descriptors, would I be able to say, well, that's this or that? Would I be able to say that it's either the Industrial Revolution or the transatlantic slave trade? Would I be able to look at descriptors like smallpox, malaria, measles, and typhus were introduced to the New World and say, you know what, that's this. So again, lots of matching and lots of synthesizing, where you have to take some stuff and either compare or contrast or bring it together. We have some questions about the slave trade, but we also have some questions about the slave trade where a cartoonist is making an argument or bringing out an ideological perspective about opinions today. So there will be some new stuff on the midterm, some new stuff about some old concepts. So we studied the slave trade, we studied the transatlantic slave trade, but we're going to give you some new information about Sudan today that you're like, oh man, I've never seen this before. But it's not a test of you recalling knowledge here. It's a test of you taking something that you already know, applying it to something new, synthesizing those 2 things to come to some kind of understanding. Questions 25 to 27 are all based on a quick quote about globalization, and more specifically about the idea of westernization, about Western imperialism. You'll see stuff like the white man's burden and all of those things connected to it. You'll see connections to gold, God, and glory as well. We have some questions about the humbling of China. So in the 19th century, China refused to take part in world trade, so the West invaded the country and forced her to participate. The above statement most likely refers to which of these 4 events. So we studied China, and you need to be able to look at the events and say, oh, this is the one that happened in China. This is the one that is the war that humbled China into being forced to be part of the global village. We have lots of questions where they give you 4 different speakers, and we want you to be able to contrast them. So questions 29 and 30 have 4 speakers, and we want you to put them into some kind of chronological order. So they're talking about some stuff. Generally, which one is talking about stuff from the 13th century? Which one's talking about stuff from the late 15th, from the mid 18th, and from the late 19th? Put them into chronological order. Another relationship you can have in an A1 is chronological order. On this test, you're going to be doing that with 4 sources. Put them into chronological order. And for the record, the conventional viewpoint about the start date of globalization in a historic sense is the age of Columbus, when Columbus discovers the Americas. So when they ask you a question like from which speaker discusses the conventional viewpoint, chapter 5 begins in the textbook with Columbus. So we'll have another source that's a couple of short paragraphs long, and the question is, which globalization concept is the focus of the above statement? So you're like, okay, these are the 4 things that this above statement's about. Which one is it about? Is it saying globalization has created a borderless world? Well, let's go and read it and see. Did it say that globalization is based on global capitalism? Let's read it and see. Is it talking about cultural imperialism? Is it talking about time-space compression? 4 different things. It's matching. You may have to go through it 4 times if you can't balance all 4 in your mind at the same time. But in a 4-hour window, you have enough time to find the answer to that. So there's lots of quotes. 32 is another quote about 16th century globalization, and again, it's asking you, something about what effect did it have. Again, nothing to study for that one, aside from working with the words on the page. We'll have a question number 33 that explores the positive and negative consequences of the British going to India. Number 34 is a quote, and we'll ask you to find what's the bias of the quote. Number 35, based on the same quote, we'll ask you to find what's the context of the quote. And number 36, we're going to ask you to look at that quote and say, which one of these G's isn't in the quote? Is it gold, God, glory, greed? What are we not seeing? We had to put some Gandhi quotes in here as well. So I have the quote, whenever I despair, I remember that the way of truth and love has always won. There may be tyrants and murderers, and for a time they may seem invincible, but in the end they always fail. Think of it always. So the quotes there are just to remind you about Gandhi. And then I want you to tell me about, based upon Gandhi's opinion about globalization, which of these 4 things is he most likely to want you to support? That's things that you would associate with Gandhi and some things that you wouldn't. So basically you guys say, which of those 4 things would Gandhi be associated with? Which of those 4 responses to globalization does he support? We talked a lot about natural, globalization exposing what is natural. So we'll have some questions that give you a chance to show me that you understand social Darwinism and natural selection and might is right and survival of the fittest. We looked at the Industrial Revolution, and we also looked at the Industrial Revolution, how it connects to imperialism and the slave trade. We'll have a series of sources on the slave trade, the Industrial Revolution. These are questions 39 to 42 that allow you to analyze the source, much like the source we saw about how when the United States increased the number of slaves, the cotton production went up. So sources like that. Or sources like Gandhi saying, let's burn the foreign clothes and just wear homespun. So we want you to be able to combine these sources and see a relationship and see bias, see limitations. We also want you to see some sequential relationship. So how does this lead to that? So we'll have 5 sources and we'll say, where's the sequential relationship that exists? Same skill you need for A1. We need to test you on the Columbian Exchange. So we have a quote on our lesson about the Columbian Exchange about how it has changed the world. And there's language within the quote, like the impoverishment and the impoverishment of genetic pool, where we change the world inadvertently or intentionally. And we want you to take the language from the source and provide possible evidence. Again, another A1 skill. There's so much overlap here. There are some questions. Number 44 is specific to the humbling of China. So there's a cartoon that we looked at in class. So almost all of this stuff is pulled from the lessons. The cartoon is something we looked at in class, and we want you to combine a cartoon with a short quote about the humbling of China and see what kind of conclusion we can make. We also have some conclusions about decolonization of Africa, and we want you to try to figure out intended messages and maybe the reasons for propaganda, some themes that hold people together. And within the story of Africa, there's room for you to remember things like Dr. Livingstone, people like King Leopold II. Questions 49 to 51 go back to the Industrial Revolution and the slave trade. And we'll see Whipping Peter again, the same cartoon. So some of it is quite familiar to you. In terms of the economics part, when we looked at ideologies, there's an expectation that you're going to remember who Robert Owen was, who Karl Marx was, who Adam Smith, the individual creditor with capitalism, was. When we looked at ideologies, another individual we mentioned, but we didn't highlight a lot, was Thomas Malthus. And Thomas Malthus believed that if you assist people living in poverty, you're going to create a population time bomb. Meaning that you're not going to force them to change, you're not going to force them to adapt. Remember, the social Darwinists thought we needed to adapt or die. Thomas Malthus would agree and would suggest that if you enable people that are living in poverty to not adapt, then it'll end up bringing about that demise for the collective we instead. We have some other sources about white man's burden towards the end again, and sources that might say, who would be the intended audience of this cartoon? So looking at details within the cartoon, who's it designed for? So stuff like that. And then we wrap up the test with 6 questions at the end. They're just based upon some short quotes where it's reading comprehension. Read this and tell me if you understand this phrase or that phrase about it. So good news, the thing that we did the most, A1, those skills that you need for A1, those are basically the same skills being tested on the multiple choice, just in a different way. Same kind of critical analytical thinking. So tonight, get ready for the A1 tomorrow on India. Tomorrow night, get ready for the essay the next day. And then by Thursday, you'll get to write this. And then good news, you have a long weekend where you should be free of social studies. When we get back from Thanksgiving, we'll make the big push for the second half of the year that begins in chapter 9. Any questions come up while I was going through that before I hit Control End? Any questions with any of the terms? Yes?
What is all the Roman and the Greek stuff about?
Yeah, so the reason why we drank the beer, we didn't drink the beer. The reason why we studied beer wasn't for the multiple choice test, so you won't see that on the multiple choice test. The reason that we studied beer was to see something about the nature of mankind. So the essay talks about mankind being exploitive, and a possible response to the essay would be, no, mankind is innovative, and we may be able to think our way past exploitation. So that would be the application of the beer thing. The beer thing was also to try to show the consequential nature of history, how one thing may lead to things that are unintended. So the unintended consequence of events. The Roman stuff, you're right, we didn't hear a lot of Roman stuff on there. Again, the Roman stuff you might see applied to the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must part of the essay. That's more of the Greek story of the Athenians and Molossians, but you could put it in as further evidence that has been seen to be right. So maybe I should put some more Roman questions on the multiple choice, because you're right, there wasn't a lot of Rome there. But there's room for Rome within the essay for sure. Any other questions? Alright, so I'm going to end the video. I made the video because we do have a few people away today.